Welcome back to the Rules of Engagement. Before we jump into our third segment, let me remind you guys, if you're interested in pursuing a career in game design, audio engineering, 3D animation, and video production, all these cool skill sets that are used in the esports and game design industry, go ahead and check out Full Sail University. Go to www.fullsail.edu/MLG for more information on our different programs in all these different fields. Of course, Full Sail is the official education partner of Major League Gaming. Our third segment is going to be on a Polt vs. Hyun game. This is game one of the grand finals of MLG Anaheim 2013. And it's mostly focused on late game TvZ. So we'll start out talking a little bit about TvZ scouting in the early game. Then we're going to jump into the late game of TvZ. So as a Terran player, what you want to start transitioning to in the late game is the Zerg player, the tactics you want to use in the late game to try to break that Terran player down and win that game. Start off at the 7-minute mark in this game. And the first thing I want to talk about briefly before we jump into the main theory of this segment, which is going to be the late game, is going to be scouting in TvZ. So a lot of Terran players are really paranoid all the time about scouting their opponent and knowing what they're up to, right? Because it could be some mass roach baiting all in. It could be fast mutas, right? You don't even know if they're playing roaches all the time or speedings or whatever. So a lot of people start scanning their opponent or doing suicide units. And that can be a way to scout your opponent, but often the most effective ways are, one, just put on some slight pressure, right? And the pressure can be with a group of units that you know is pretty safe, right? This squad of units at the 8-minute mark can beat speedlings, and if there's roaches, you just run away from them. If there's a bunch of queens, you run away from them. If there's a lot of speedlings, you can kind of kite backwards and at least trade pretty decently, unless you get too surrounded. So that's step one of scouting. Now step two is like, you know what, I'm macroing up like crazy. I'm getting my third command center. I'm going to get double E-base as well off of only 3 production buildings. But I really am kind of scared about what he might be doing to kind of harass me or maybe attack me, right? So there's 2 things to do. One, notice when the roaches moved out, Polt didn't run back to his base. Instead what he did is he looped around the roaches. And that's so important because you want to know, okay, is it 5 roaches attacking me? Well, I don't care. My bunker can hold that off easy with the widow mines or whatever, right? Or is it 5 roaches in the front and a whole bunch of speedings being rallied behind? It could turn to banings, or another 6, 7, 8 roaches behind that. What's behind those roaches? So you circle around behind to get more information on scouting your opponent. That's always something you want to do whenever you see roaches. Of course, you want to avoid being trapped if possible. Losing one helling's not that big a deal. Now, step 2 of scouting, right, is if you already have a Viking around, send that around to kill your opponent's overlords. That's not really going to give you scouting, but denies them scouting, which is almost just as good. And then, of course, the last step of scouting is as soon as you get a medevac out, and we can find this guy, what you want to do is not only do you want to drop to harass your opponent, but often drop plays one of the best ways to scout your opponent. So as soon as you kind of lose eyes on them with your harass force, in this case it's the Reapers and Hellings here, they did that last scout, saw drones are being built, saw it's not really a crazy all-in, it's a standard 3-base macro play. So he's comfortable for now, but then how is his opponent going to transition? Is he going to keep you in roaches? Is he going to get a spire when the lair is done? These are things he wants to know. So he counts, okay, the lair is starting now. I want to scout again in a little bit. Well, why not, instead of scanning, right? Let's use the, let's find this medevac again. Let's just use this medevac to scout. So around the same time the lair is finished, he can send in this medevac, and there was fast forwarding this point, using the medevac to scout, right? And this will not only harass his opponent a bit, but he knows, okay, for my earlier scout, there's no super fast mutas. So nothing can kill a medevac as long as I don't walk it into a spore or do something careless. And even though there's nothing going on in the game, so a player like Hyun is not going to really lose much of this medevac. But it's not really there necessarily to cripple Hyun or do great damage. It's there to be annoying. If you can kill a creep tumor here or there, maybe catch a queen if it's trying to spread creep and it's alone and unguarded. Maybe kill a roach or a speedling, deny some vision, scare Paul a bit. But the primary reason is really just to keep eyes on his army and try to see how the army grows. The best way to scout what your opponent is doing is always to scout their army. Scouting the base can be confusing. There's a lot of buildings. You may not seal the buildings. They could have, a roach warren and a spire. You don't know if they're going roaches or mutas. But if you scout their army and the way their army grows, that tells you exactly what they're doing. So as he sees roaches, he's saying, are there more roaches behind that? Or is there mutas? We're going to go ahead and kill this overlord. Next step, we'll fast forward again, is another little poke out. And remember how we talked about TvZ aggression last game? You want to be afraid if your opponent could have a much larger army. You don't want to risk losing your units. So when Polt moves out, he has enough medevacs to pick up 90% of his units here, right? So he can't lose too much. If Hyun's being greedy, he can kill him. if he's playing fairly standardly, he can at least see what units he has, and now he knows what's going on, right? So he's seen the fact it's roach baiting. He knows he's not fighting against Mulus. And then the third thing is if opponent has too many units, he can easily pick up and escape with this army. So his opponent tries to swarm him, he picks up, loses like 1 or 2 Marines, kills some speedlings, and you can use the medevacs now to circle around here and grab this base as well. Or actually, going to go straight to the main. So the dropships not only are for harass, but they're always a great scouting tool as well. Now, we'll do this on X4 to get to the meat of the game. It's a fairly standard TvZ macro game. One thing to notice is Hyun is doing a mass unit build, right? More pressure with you know, Widow Mines and Marines. And Hyun's approach to this is he's not going Mutalisk. He's massing units. An idea of massing units is you can have a very strong army. You can overwhelmingly push your opponent does like that and take it out easily. So you don't have to worry about being killed by their attacks. The disadvantage is drop play can be really tricky. Right? These drops can be really, really annoying. So how do you deal with drop play if you're a player without Mutalisk? If you don't have Mutalisk, you have to make that static defense, right? So you're getting the spines, the spores to cover all the angles. Because your big army can fight well in the open, but it can't instantly jump from this corner of your base to this corner to deal with drops and jump back into main. So notice how he's making sure no drops can hit the main. Spore cores at the bottom left section. No drops into third, spore cores at the bottom left. Why is he not worried about medevacs coming in through the very middle? Because that's where his army is. If they fly over his army, he's going to be able to keep track of them, just follow them around very easily. And again, at this base as well, stack defense coming in from the far angles. If medevac comes in from this angle, his units can be there much faster because this spot is much closer to his army than, let's say, this spot. So it's a fairly standard way. If you're not going to make Mutalisk, you want to get that stack defense. Now, what Polt's doing is he's seeing if he can get some great Widow Mine hits, some great engagements, trade really well, and if he can, maybe he can overwhelm his opponent, start taking out bases. But at a certain point, he's realizing, you know what? My opponent's not coming to a big attack on me. His defense is very solid. He has a large army. He's defending very well. I probably can't kill him, right? I probably can't end the game right now. So what Polt wants to do now is he wants to start transitioning to the late game, right? And he knows, you know what, Marine Marauder Widow Mine is great at pressuring my opponent, but if I can't really get any big wins, if he's playing very well, if every time that I engage, he's able to kind of not dominate my army, but he's able to push me back and take some more control of the map, what do I want to do? I want to go for the super late game. And the ideal super late game for Terran is battlecruisers and ravens. Those are the 2 units you're going for. And a couple steps to go for him are as follows. 1, you want to have at least 4 bases. So he's got his 4th base here. 2, make sure your bases are safe. So he's got a planetary there. And more importantly, is his units rally out, he wants to defend this central section. If he loses this section, 4th base gets cut off, he can die easily to Banings, Ultras, etc. Also, if he loses this section, if his army's over here, his opponent can just quickly go up here and kill this base. So it's very important that he defends this zone of the map. And so what he's doing is he's building another command center here. He's going to put a planetary fortress in this zone because it's a very important zone to protect. He wants to make sure he can't lose that. So he's making sure he has a very safe 4 bases. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is start that transition. Start adding the starports to get that transition over to the BC Ravens. Keep your upgrades going. Those not only help your medevacs and your Widow Mines, they also help the BC Ravens as you get to there. We can see here's the starports being added. Where are they? They're right here. At his 3rd base, adding 2 more starports. We might add a few more later on. Start that transition. And then number 3, realize, okay, I want to defend and make sure I keep 4 bases alive. What do I need to do that? Well, what can Zerg do to kill my bases? Well, if I put a planetary here, I get this planetary up here. I've got a planetary in my 4th. I've got a bunch of Widow Mines. In one straight engagement, he can't overwhelm me very easily, right? There's no way Hyun can just overrun his position with this many Widow Mines, at least once his planetary gets up. But what can Zerg do in a late game to overrun a defensive Terran? What a Zerg can do is, let's say if he gets a 200 food army and a ton of resources in the bank up here, he can just send in 1 giant wave of Ultralists that would, let's say, kill most of this, and then Terran have a few units left. And then just use the fact that Zerg can remax faster and send another giant wave of Ultralists before Polt can rebuild his defenses, because Terran takes a little bit longer to replenish their forces than a Zerg does. So what does Polt do to avoid this? He says, you know what? I don't want to let Hyun get a giant bank of resources. So how does he do that? Well, he keeps small trades, right? In a big engagement, his army is going to be weaker because he's dealing with infestors, and of course, he's trying to transition to air. But constant small trades, even if it's not the greatest small trade, that's not too great, but over here it's going to be a little better, killing a bunch of speedings, forcing Hyun to constantly have to replenish his forces, right? If Hyun has to constantly spend money, even if Polt's not doing damage, right? He's not killing hatcheries or drones in a significant number. He's not even trading that great. But if he keeps Hyun's resource count low, Hyun can't do a giant ultraless baneling, overwhelm his defense's style of play. And that's what he's afraid of. He's afraid that Hyun can overwhelm him with ultras and banelings before he gets his late game transition going. So that's why he's constantly poking. And why is he poking with small forces, not his whole army? Well, if he pokes his whole army and it dies, all of a sudden he's very exposed to a counterattack. If he pokes his small forces, keeps the trade small, he can keep the resource count low for Hyun, for both players in fact, but also not expose himself to a giant counterattack. So constant small pokes, attacking multiple sides at once, just trying to keep Hyun on the defensive, trying to keep the resource count low. And we can see it's starting to get a little bit higher now, but at this point in time, he's already starting to get his Ravens out. His transition is closing into where he gets that super late game Terran death ball. So of course he's going to probably lose this space here because that'll be taken out easily by Banings. And you can see Zerg can always break a planetary if they're willing to expend some Banings on it. It's not always cost efficient, but it's what they can do, which is why Polt's trying to keep the gas count low from the Zerg so we can't do the same thing to the even more important planetary, the one over here. We'll fast forward just a little bit to the late game. And by now, Hyun's figured out what's going on, right? He's figured out his opponent's bleeding away small groups of units, playing very defensively. He's got to be transitioning to super air. So what Hyun wants to do is he wants to try to overwhelm his opponent's defense and break through and get at all the production buildings. Because in the long game, it's almost impossible to beat BC Raven if a player like Polt's controlling it in a straight-up engagement. But what Zerg's power is they can overwhelm their opponent with numbers before their opponent can replenish their forces. That's exactly what Hyun's doing right now. Is this mass baiting attack cost efficient? No, it's not, right? He's losing 2 to 3 baitings per Widow Mine, and the baiting and Widow Mine are actually almost even in cost. So yes, he kills a planetary. Yes, he overwhelms a lot of the defenses. He killed all the baitings, but it wasn't very cost efficient, that engagement. The good side is, though, if Hyun can remax very quickly, see more speediness and ultras on the way, once he gets into the production facilities, all of a sudden Terran starts falling apart. But good news for Polt is he's already produced the battle cruisers, and once these guys are out, it might take him a little bit longer to mop up the ultralists, but they are going to help clean this force up much, 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 much faster. So fast forward here again. Remember, time is against Hyun because he's not trading efficiently. If the map gets split, he's going to lose. But if he can overwhelm, get on top of the barracks, then when the Marines increment out, all of a sudden he does very well. So that's why he's streaming units in. Yes, the BCs will kill some, but if he can take out all the production, then all there's left is BCs. If he can kill all his opponent's infrastructure, get all the workers, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to take this. There's this short moment here after that engagement where all the Widow Mines got used up. There's a short moment where, in a brief period of time, Polt has very few units and he can't build very many units. In the long run, of course, he can rebuild everything. In a short run, even if he had the resources, he doesn't have the barracks production time, the starport production time, and the factory production time to rebuild it all. So unfortunately for Hyun, he ran out of resources. He couldn't keep flooding units, and he doesn't have quite enough to finish the job. So he did a lot of damage here to a lot of these bases, but he wasn't able to break the infrastructure of the main or take Polt down to less than 4 bases, right? That's the key thing. Hyun really wanted to take down less than 4 bases. So even though, yes, Polt's down only 38 SCVs, he's got enough mules, it's not that big a deal. Yes, he killed a bunch of depots, he killed a bunch of add-ons, and he got in here, but he wasn't able to either kill all the infrastructure or trim Polt down to less than 4 bases, and now Polt has this giant BC Raven force. It's looking very, very bad for Hyun as the game goes on. Even if he can't be up a base, even if he's 5 bases, if he can find a way to deny this again, it's still going to be not looking that great for him because that Terran late game army is very strong. So he's realized he couldn't break his opponent with that attack. He's realized by now Polt's going to have even more BCs and Ravens. He's going to have to find a way to beat that army. So he's going to try to get upgrades for the Queens, Neural Parasite, and going to have one great engagement with the Queens. And if he can make this battle work, that's his last chance to get in the game, or to win the game is, of course, his last Queen engagement. So he's pushing out here. He wants it as fast as possible. Because as more time goes on, the Ravens get scarier and scarier, and Polt is able to rebuild more and more BCs. But he also has to get a creep pushed out there, which is kind of a tricky situation, because without the creep, Queens can't do too much. And off creep, they're not as strong. So let's actually back this up. I want to go through this battle again. So we talk about why Hyun really needs to attack now before Terran army gets too much bigger. But now I want to talk about, from a Terran point of view, how to control this army. There's a lot of different parts to it, right? You've got the bio army that if the bio charges forward, it's going to die to fungals and ultras. So you kind of want to keep it back. Just don't worry about it. Just keep it in the back and forget about it for a while. The next part is you got the BCs. They're pretty tanky. Unless your opponent has a lot of corruptors or like a whole ton of hydralists, they can take a good amount of beating. So those can be up in the front. Then the next part is the Ravens. Ravens are really the key power to Polt's army. And the most important thing to do with the Ravens is, one, make sure they don't all get fungal. That's number one important. So notice how Polt has them a little bit spread out here, right? He's got, see how he's individually selecting them? You can see his mouse selects. He's having this one go down, this one down to right, and this one he's going to have it go up a bit. And the reason why, see how when the fungal, it can't hit them all. If it's 1 or 2, it's not that big a deal. It can't hit them all. So always focus on the Raven control first. Make sure they're spread out and land Seekers on your opponent's important units that are slow, which means the Infestors and then the Queens. So he used them all in the Infestors, which is a priority. Second priority would be Queens, put down the PDD to help block some Queen shots, and now he's trying to get out of there. Once the Infestors are gone, all of a sudden then your Bio Army can be engaged, right? So as soon as the Infestors are gone, the Bio Army charges forward. Without fungal growth, you can kite against Ultralists, and you're going to be very cost efficient against Queens. I mean, it takes a while to kill Queens, but their damage output is too low to actually kill the Bio units when his Medivacs in there. Of course, he backed away from the Ultras for a bit, wants to make sure he can take those one at a time, wants to make sure the other ones are stuck behind the Queens during this engagement. And then he's just going to, once he kills the Ultras, the Queens will go down shortly thereafter. Transfuses are very important here, right? So this battle can take a while. But important to know, even though the Zerg army looks like it's holding strong for a little while, without Infestors, he can't actually kill anything, right? Because the Bio can kite back. The BCs just don't die because they're battle cruisers, right? So they're not meant to die. And now with that attack failed, Hyun's in a tough position. I mean, yes, he was able to not deny this, but at least he's not being mined. He's up a base. But he's in a situation where he couldn't dent this army enough. He killed a few Ravens, but there's still a lot of BCs out. There's still a Biocore force, and once a few more Ravens get added in, it's going to be back to that Doom army. So we're going to stop the street play here. Polt goes on to win his first game just a few minutes later. Of course, he's playing safe. You don't want to attack his Terran. Once you get to that late game BC Raven force, to stay very defensive until you get a max force of BC Ravens, then you can start pushing out. But really, just defensive, build the Doom army, and focus on the Raven control in battles. A couple of things that are very important about this game I want you guys to take away from is, one is a Terran. If you're trying to get to that late game, in the mid game, instead of going for giant army pushes, go for a lot of small trades. Because what a small trade does, it stops your opponent from being that giant resource bank where they can just throw a massive wave of ultras at you, and then they can remax in like 30 corruptors and kill all your air, and then turn them into broodlords, and then you lose, right? Just because they have so much resources. So a lot of small trades. So one, you don't risk losing your entire army, and two, you keep the Zerg resource bank a little bit lower than they want to get to. From a Zerg point of view, against Terran, you either want to have Mutilus or stack defense, because drop play can be very scary. So a lot of pro Zergs go Mutilus. You saw this game, Hyun said, you know what? I just want a very powerful ground army, so I'm going to skip the Mutilus. But he built a lot of Spore Cores and Spine Cores on all the corners of his bases, because a ground army has a hard time getting to the corners of the map. That's what Mutilus can do. They can get the corners of the map very quickly. If you don't have them, get that stack defense. From a Terran point of view, in the late game, start going for the air army. The Ravens and BCs are super powerful and super cost efficient. They're very difficult to produce. So that's when the planetaries come in, that's when the small trades and the drops come in to buy time. But if you can get there, the Terran air army in the late game is exceptionally strong against Zerg. Of course, for Zerg, if you're figuring out how to beat that, don't think about necessarily trying to kill their army. Try to kill as much of it as you can, and think of a remax plan. So your plan could be, I'll run into billion Ultralists, take out all the ground, get in his production, deal with his infrastructure, and he might have a few BCs flying around picking at them, but if I can kill all the Marines, kill all the missile turrets, then I can remax in air and get a bunch of corruptors, and those can kill the BCs now because they're vulnerable. So your Zerg late game plan is usually a 2-army plan. You have your first army to get in there and your second army to finish it off. So that's your Zerg late game. You're not going to always win in a one-punch battle. Against Bio with Infestor Ultra you can, but against air you might not. But if you can overwhelm them with continual remaxes, that's your strength as Zerg in the late game. This wraps up analysis on the Hyun vs. Polt game. We'll take a short break and be right on to the Q&A.